This is a course in in the philosophy of society. I mentioned last time, but I want to emphasize it again. I think there is a need for such a subject, and I predict that it will gradually grow as we recognize that there is a branch of philosophy that is concerned with the ontology and the structure of society in the same way that there is a branch of philosophy of mind concerned with the ontology and the structure of the mind, or for that matter, a branch of the philosophy of language concerned with the ontology and the structure of language. It's important to emphasize that philosophical subjects are not inevitable or eternal. The philosophy of language was effectively invented by Gottlob Frege in the late 19th century. Before that, there was nothing that could reasonably call the philosophy of language. Yes, I realize that Locke devoted a whole book of the essay to language, but he had other axes to grind or other fish to fry, to mix the metaphor. He really wasn't concerned with language in a way that we have since been concerned with it. And there are many courses in the universities in the United States in something called social philosophy, but they do not deal with the kind of questions that I'll be dealing with. They primarily are concerned either with social and political philosophy, in which case they're concerned with things like justice and the nature of political obligation, or they are social philosophy in the sense that they're philosophy of the social sciences, and they deal with social science explanation. Now, I'm going to argue that in order to answer those questions, you first have to get clear about the ontology of social reality. If you don't know what an institution is or an institutional fact, then you won't find it very easy to explain what a just one is or a justifiable one, and you won't find it very easy to explain what it's like to give explanations in the social sciences. So what I'm going to say, I think, is crucially relevant to the traditional issues, but I don't start with them. We'll get to them. But just to give you a hint of some of the things we're going to get to. For the past century, a great issue in the philosophy of social sciences was whether or not the methods of explanation that work in the natural sciences work in the social sciences. And the picture that people have is that in the natural sciences, we explain a phenomenon by showing how its occurrence can be deduced from laws of nature together with a description of initial conditions. So if you want an explanation of why this piece of chalk falls the way it did, then what you show is that its particular fall, the nature of its fall, can simply be deduced, a straight logical deduction from a statement of the relevant laws together with a description of the initial conditions. The law in question, I think it's called Galileo's law, but don't quote me on that. It's got a name. But here it is. The distance or space that the object falls is equal to 1/2 of the gravitational constant times the square of the time that it falls. Now, the explanation of its fall is given by deducing what occurs from this law together with a description that fills in the values of the variables, in this case that fills in the amount of time. And then that will predict what distance it will fall. And on this model's got a name. You're going to hear more about it later. On this model, prediction and explanation are exactly symmetrical. You can predict what's going to happen in the future. You can explain what happened in the past, but you do it in both cases by deducing the phenomenon that occurred from the description of the situation or the values of these variables together with a statement of this law. And that model of explanation has got a name. It's called the deductive nomological model. Deductive nomological model of explanation. Deductive because you deduce something, and nomological means having to do with laws, and you deduce it from the statement of the law together with the other conditions. Now this particular model of explanation aroused a great deal of enthusiasm among philosophers of science in the middle decades of the 20th century. And one of its great beauties is that it seemed to make scientific investigation and scientific explanation of the same pattern. Because the way, according to this, that you conduct the investigation is you state a hypothesis, that's S, and then you deduce from the you state a hypothesis, which is this whole law, and then you deduce from the hypothesis a prediction, and then you test to see if the prediction comes true. And that method of scientific investigation is called a hypothetico-deductive method, because on that account you form a hypothesis and then you deduce a prediction, and then you see whether or not the prediction is verified, see whether or not it comes true. Now the idea is this works beautifully for the natural sciences, and I'm just telling you what other people think. I'm not telling you what I think yet. I think the whole discussion is misconceived, but right now you got to know what everybody else thinks, not what I think. And what everybody else thinks is this is an absolutely beautiful conception of the methods of the natural sciences. Now, why doesn't it work for the social sciences? Well, a lot of people say it does work for the social sciences. It just, we don't know enough of these laws, or the laws are kind of complicated, or you got to allow for all sorts of interfering factors. But the idea is that this stuff works for the natural sciences and it works for the social sciences as well. And might as well know some names. The big honcho in the deductive nomological camp is a guy named Carl Gustav Hempel, known to all of his friends as Peter. I don't know why. I never asked him, Peter, why are you called Peter instead of Carl Gustav? But anyway, Peter Hempel, or Carl Gustav Hempel, I think before he fled Hitler, I think he was in Berlin. He was not part of that Vienna gang, but don't quote me on that. Anyway, he wound up at Princeton, which is where I met him. This is the Hempelian or deductive nomological model, and this model of investigation, the hypothetico-deductive, is usually attributed to Karl Popper, and there was a fairly nasty dispute at one point as to who thought of this stuff first. Was it Hempel or Popper? Okay, that's mainstream philosophy of science. Philosophy of science says this is how explanation works. It's deductive nomological, and then the question is, does it work for the social sciences? Granted that it works for physics and chemistry, how about the social sciences? And here there was a split. Some people, many people said the social sciences are just as much honest to John deductive nomological sciences as the natural sciences. It has to work for the social sciences, or they wouldn't be real sciences. But then there was another school that went back to the 19th century that said no. For the social sciences, to understanding human society and human life generally, you need a different kind of explanation. You've got to get inside the minds of the people whose behavior you are explaining. If you want to know why Napoleon invaded Russia, or why Hitler and the Nazis lost the Second World War, you can't deduce it from a set of laws, or a set of laws together with descriptions of the situation on the ground. You've got to understand the thoughts and feelings of the participants. And the opposition to the deductive nomological and hypothetical deductive model was the model of understanding. And sometimes people said that there's a big gulf between explanation, which is what I've been talking about over here, versus understanding. And it always sounds more profound if you say it in German. So this stuff over here was called verstehen. And what we seek, where human beings and human society concerned, is not erklären, it's not understanding, it's not explanation, but it's an understanding of the phenomenon, and that requires us to have verstehen. And I'll tell you the names of some of the guys on this side. One of the early champions of this stuff was a German philosopher named Dilthey. A friend of mine wrote a thesis on Dilthey and always referred to him as filthy Dilthey, so I'm apologizing to Dilthey. That I can't help thinking of that whenever I write his name on the blackboard. There were other people, Rickert and various others, but Dilthey was one of the earliest advocates of understanding. And one of the guys you're going to read is a contemporary named Chuck Taylor, Charles Taylor, a Canadian, who thinks that the deductive nomological model doesn't work. Anyway, today's lecture is not about this stuff, but I want to look ahead a bit because I want you to keep in mind that as I explain the nature of society to you, where it's going to have implications for how we explain social phenomena. In other words, if you want to know what the right form of explanation is, tell me exactly what you want to explain. And you can't answer that question, what do you want to explain, until you know what sort of thing it is. If you want to explain the behavior of money and private property and governments and political parties and marriage and universities, then you have to understand something about the ontology of those phenomena, and that's what we're going to be concerned about in the first part of this course. Okay, now I said last time that our aim is to show how social ontology, the ontology of money and private property and all that other stuff that we'll be talking about, how that is not just consistent with what we know about physics and chemistry, but it's a natural consequence. If you understand physics and chemistry properly, and you understand how they relate to other phenomena, if you understand the causal mechanisms in question, you will see why there are going to be human institutions in a world made up entirely of physical particles. Now you might say, how the hell do you get from the physical particles to the institutions? Well, that's part of what the subject matter of the course is. But let me, while skipping over a lot of crucial steps, let me mention some bare bones features of the outline. Think of the universe as composed of physical particles, mostly in empty space. I mean, most of the universe is made up of literally nothing. And of course, particles is probably not the right word to describe the stuff that we're talking about. But the basic idea, forgetting whether or not string theory or points of mass energy or whatever is the right way of describing the particles. Incidentally, I liked physics a lot better when there were electrons, protons, and neutrons. I thought I understood the damn thing. But as soon as these guys got allowed into the house, quarks and muons and leptons and charm and all kinds of messy stuff, it got much messier. But anyway, that's what I'm paying them to do. Get busy and get it figured out and figure out what the basic particles are. Whatever they are, we'll leave to the guys who get paid to do that. We're going to assume big things are made out of little things. That's the technical notion that we'll have. And if you want to understand the big things, you better understand how they're made out of the little things. Okay, so we got this universe consisting of these physical particles. Now, some of them are organized into systems. And what is a system? Well, it's a collection of particles that has boundaries set by essentially causation. So a galaxy is a system, but so is a water molecule, and so is a baby, and so it's going to turn out as a nation state or a political party. So the particles are organized into systems. Now, some of these systems in a really little corner of the universe, not even a suburb, but just a dinky little planet in a minor, I mean the most minor kind of solar system you can imagine. On that planet, there were a whole lot of big carbon-based molecules, and they had a lot of hydrogen, nitrogen, and oxygen. Now, why we have this obsession with these four elements, I don't know. A chemist once explained it to me, but I'd had a lot to drink, and I must have dozed off after a while. But he explained to me how evolution of life could not have occurred with silicon, and I took his word for it. Okay, so the evolution of life on this Earth, I mean, it may not be much of a planet, but it's ours, right? It's our damn planet, and we like it, even if nobody else does. All right, so on this little planet, there was the evolution of big carbon-based molecules. Now, one of the horrible things about education is they never tell you what they don't know, right? I'm offended that when I took biology as an undergraduate, they didn't tell me they didn't understand the mechanisms of heredity. Later on, it was discovered when I was still an undergraduate by two guys in Cambridge whom I later got to know, Francis Crick and Jim Watson. But they didn't tell me when I took biology, we don't know how the hell genetics works, and we don't know how heredity works, but they didn't. Now, here's the one thing they don't tell you. We don't know how life started. How did life get going on this earth? We don't know. We assume, we mumble things like that. Well, there was the primal slime, you see, and it was kind of warm, and there were these big carbon-based molecules. Okay, but eventually, I assume we'll figure that out. All right, so here we are. We're on this earth. We got a lot of carbon-based molecules, and somehow or other, life began. Organic compounds began to multiply. They began to reproduce by the molecules replicating themselves, and eventually they got bigger organisms. Now we're talking about a long period of time, and again, this annoys me. How old is the universe? I memorized 15 billion years, but it keeps getting younger. Last time I read anything, it was 13 billion years. How long has evolution been going on? Well, roughly speaking, 3 to 5 billion years. Well, thanks a lot. I mean, we don't feel like we better check our watch. But anyway, it's a hell of a long time. And over that period of evolution, a lot of complex organisms evolved. And now another amazing thing happened. Some of those organisms developed a certain kind of cell. Now, incidentally, the cell is the basic notion in biology, just as the atom is the basic notion in physics, and the tectonic plate is the basic notion in geology. Mature sciences typically have a fundamental notion. The fundamental notion of biology is the cell, as the fundamental notion of genetics is the DNA molecule. Here's a scandal. Neuroscience has no fundamental notion. They will tell you that it's the neuron, but they're embarrassed by that because nobody knows quite how the neuron does all the stuff that we are pretty sure happens. And so we're not sure if we should be looking at different units. Can I get a new blackboard down? Well, maybe I'll stay with this one. Okay, but in any case, we had these organisms evolving, and some of these organisms evolved a peculiar kind of cell called a neuron. And the neuron is a cell like any other. It's got a cell wall and a nucleus, but it's different from other cells in that it's got a whole lot of stringy things that come off of it. It's got one long stringy job called an axon, and then it's got a whole lot of spiny things called dendrites. And the neurons communicate with other neurons where the axons of one neuron get next to the dendrites of the next neuron. Now, I won't tell you all the details, but for a long time people thought it has to be some kind of direct connection. It has to go, the axon sends an electrical signal, and that's picked up by the dendrite of the next neuron in line, and then that goes on through the cell nucleus until it fires other axons and other dendrites. The problem with that picture, however, is it's inaccurate. What happens is the dendrites of one neuron do not connect to the axon of the next neuron. Rather, they get real close together, and there's a little space called the synapse. And the synapse is a piece of anatomy, but the crucial element in the synapse is a little cleft between the dendrites of the receiving element of the signal and the axon of the sender. And across the synaptic cleft, the firing axon sends some neurotransmitters, and those are picked up by a bunch of receptors on the dendritic side, and they then convert that into an electrical charge that then goes to the cell nucleus. So the passage is not electrical to electrical, but it's electrical, chemical, electrical. How the hell am I lecturing on neuro anatomy? I didn't intend to do that, but anyway, you ought to know a little bit about the basis of this. I wrote a book called A Mystery of Consciousness, where there's a whole lot of pictures of neurons and axons and dendrites. Incidentally, I mistakenly got the reputation as an expert on this kind of stuff. I'm not. What I did was read the freshman textbooks. You want to know what people know about any subject, go buy the freshman textbooks, and you will find that you're routinely, mistakenly assumed to be an expert, even though you're, roughly speaking, at the level of the freshman midterm exam. But I discovered this when I was a rug collector, and I went on and bought all the books on antique rugs, and I discovered I knew more than the dealers. You know, the dealers were busy misidentifying rugs that I could tell them were not offshars, they were tekes or whatever it happened to be. So what I'm giving you is not my own research. It isn't that I went in and did a whole lot of research on the anatomy of the synaptic cleft, but it's standard textbook material. Okay, here's what's remarkable. If you get a whole lot of neurons together, the thing can become conscious. And that's what happens to us. Now, here's another scandal in our intellectual life. We don't know how the brain does it. We know that the brain produces consciousness, but we don't know exactly how. We're pretty sure that neurons, or perhaps whole bunches of neurons, neuronal maps or clouds of neurons, are the basic functional unit, but how exactly do neurons firings produce consciousness? Now, as I said, I wrote a book about that where I reviewed a whole lot of other people. It's called The Mystery of Consciousness, and it's published by the New York Review of Books if you want to look at it. All right. But there are two things we know did happen. One, life began. It began with big carbon-based molecules. And two, it evolved to the point that some organisms were conscious. Well, what is consciousness? Now, another thing that drives me crazy is that people always say, consciousness is very hard to define. It's a very mysterious notion. It's deeply mystical, maybe not a suitable object for science at all. And whenever somebody tells you something like that, don't think about having a mystical experience. Think about wanting to go to the bathroom or having a bad taste of coffee in your mouth. That's consciousness. I mean, it need not be anything that only Johann Sebastian Bach could comprehend. Even he had to go to the bathroom once in a while. So we're talking about consciousness as an ordinary biological phenomenon. Well, what is it? If it's so hard to define, let's do it. Now, you have to distinguish different kinds of definitions. There's the definition that tells you the result of the scientific investigation, and that comes at the end of the study. Water is defined as H2O. But before you get to that stage, you have to have a definition that identifies what it is you're talking about. Water is a clear, colorless, tasteless liquid. This is an example I got here in this glass. It falls out of the sky in the form of rain and snow, and it exists in lakes and streams and rivers, and it exists in oceans with an awful lot of salt in it. That's the common sense definition of water. Even that isn't very accurate. They always say water is tasteless. It's not tasteless. It tastes like water. Anyway, okay, so with consciousness, we are at the colorless liquid stage of the definition, but I can give you a definition of consciousness. Consciousness consists of those states of feeling or sentience or awareness that typically begin in the morning when you wake up from a dreamless sleep, and they go on all day until you fall asleep again or get knocked out or die or go into a coma or otherwise become, as they would say, unconscious. As I said, we don't know how the brain does it, but we know it happens. We know that we are conscious and that all sorts of other organisms are conscious, and we know that it's entirely caused by brain processes. Okay, so in our progressive ontology of how the world works, We went from physical particles to organic compounds and life, and we went from life to consciousness. We're still not yet to society, but we're off and running. The next crucial notion is one I introduced at the end last time, and I'm now going to slow down and explain it in more detail because that's the one that's going to be crucial for understanding society, and that is the notion of intentionality. Intentionality, you remember I defined as that feature of the mind by which it is directed at or about objects and states of affairs in the world, typically independent of itself. What's the connection between consciousness and intentionality? Well, lots of intentional states are not conscious. So I have the belief that Washington was first president of the United States even when I'm sound asleep. You don't have to be conscious of every mental state that you have. But, and furthermore, there are lots of conscious states that are not intentional. If you have a sense of anxiety or you just feel nervous about something, that is a conscious state, but it need not have an object. It need not be directed at anything. Okay, but there is this connection. If you have an unconscious mental state, it's got to be the kind of thing that could be accessible to consciousness because the peculiar features of intentionality require that it be the sort of thing you can think. If it's not even the kind of thing that you could in principle think or become conscious of, then it can't be intentional. Now, what are those features? Well, that's where we are now, and that's where I'm picking up from last time, and I'm going to go through the features of intentionality because they're going to be crucial to us in understanding society. Again, I apologize for the speed with which we're going. If this were a course in the philosophy of mind, I'd spend a whole lot of time on theories of consciousness and stuff like that. But now our aim here is to get to society, and I just need to give you enough tools so that you can see how we build up social ontology out of simpler elements. Let's stop for questions about what I said so far. Any questions about all that? I actually covered a lot of ground and probably said too much, but in any case, those are some basic notions. Now we're going to pick up and go through step by step a theory of intentionality. So questions so far? Everybody's up with us. Okay, yeah.
If intentionalities have to be thought or something that you can think,
yeah,
then how can they be not conscious?
Okay. And that's a very good question. If intentionality has to be something that is thought or that you could think, then how can it be unconscious? And the answer is there are all kinds of things that you do which require intentionality, where the intentionality in question is not something you're thinking about at the moment. For example, when I drive to the campus, I never think about that you're supposed to drive on the right-hand side of the road. It's just automatic. I do it unconsciously. I mean, that's a case where I follow a rule without thinking about it. Now, when I get to England and I have to remind myself to drive on the left, then that'll be a case where I have to start thinking about it. But there are lots of things you do where you're not conscious of the mechanisms by which you do them. And this is a source of big disputes in cognitive science, because a lot of people have thought, well, the right way to explain things in cognitive science is to show that you're implementing a computer program. But then the question is, what is the psychological reality of the computer program? And they say, well, you're unconsciously following a rule. And I think that's a mistake if it's not the kind of rule that you could become conscious of. The whole point about rule following, it's something you can do on purpose. Now, there are things that look like you're following a rule where I think you're not following a rule. Let me give you an obvious example. If you look at me and move your head up and down, you'll find that your eye stays focused on me even though your head is moving. Similarly, if you move it right to left, your eye stays focused on me. And that is a mechanism in the brain that enables you to do that. It's called the vestibular ocular reflex, or the VOR among friends. And I'm not going to write the whole damn thing out on the blackboard, but it's vestibular, ocular, reflex. Now, how does it work? Well, it looks like you're following a rule, and that is move your eyeball exactly equal and opposite to the movement of the head. So I move my head to the left 15 degrees, my eyeball will go to the right 15 degrees, and similarly with the up and down. But I want to say that looks like rule-governed behavior, but it's not. It's just a reflex. I'm not following any rule. What happens is there is a series of stimulations in the inner ear. Do you remember the inner ear? It's about the only thing I remember from high school. But they did teach us about the middle ear and the inner ear and that kind of junk. And it stimulates the cranial nerves. It stimulates the 8th cranial nerve, and a signal goes to the cerebellum, and the cerebellum activates the muscles in the eyeball so that your eye will move equal and opposite to the movement of your head. Now, that's a case where I want to say it's not a case of rule following, because you couldn't become conscious of that. It's just a mechanism that works automatically in the brain. Now, you could think, I'm going to consciously move my eyeball whenever I move my head. It's not easy to do it, but that's not what happens when I'm actually moving my head while looking at something or while moving around. I mean, you see this when you drive a car. If you've ever seen a movie taken from a moving car, it looks like Yellowstone Park jumps around a lot in a way that you don't remember jumping around. And the reason is that when you were driving through Yellowstone, your head and your eyeball made all the automatic adjustments so that you stabilize the retinal image. The VOR plays an important function in that it stabilizes the retinal image. Okay, so we're going to hear more about that when we get to intentionalistic explanations. And later on, just to look ahead, I'm going to argue that intentionalistic explanations are absolutely crucial to understanding social phenomena. You cannot understand the causes of the First World War, or for the exact matter, the causes of the current recession, unless you see the role of intentional causation. Now, this is disguised from us by the fact that we can often give predictions that are based on systematic fallouts of intentionality, and indeed economic theory is a classic case of that. The economist will tell you that the rational entrepreneur will sell where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. That this is the point at which it's rational in the theory of the firm for the firm to sell where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. But that's not psychologically real. No business person ever asks herself, well, am I selling where marginal cost equals marginal revenue? Now they've all been to business school, so maybe they do. But before they had been corrupted by reading economics textbooks, they just thought, how the hell can we make more money? And we got to maximize profits and raise the value of the stock. But the economist will tell you, well, really, this is what explains it. They're selling where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. And that looks like it's not intentionalistic. But later on, I'm going to argue it's a systematic fallout. It's a consequence of intentionalistic modes of explanation. Okay. Here we go with any other questions. That's a very good question. Yeah?
Forgive me if I'm behind somehow, but I seem to be missing what exactly the definition of intentionality is.
Yes, intentionality is that feature of the mind by which it is directed at or about or of objects and states of affairs in the world. If I have a belief, it must be a belief that such and such is the case. If I have a desire, it must be a desire for something or that something should occur. If I have an intention, it must be an intention to do something. And if you say to me, I've got a very strong belief today, and I say, well, what is it that you believe exactly? And you say, oh, I don't believe anything in particular. I just have this belief. And I say, well, if you got a belief, it's got to be a belief about something. It's got to have some content to it. That's the mark of intentionality. And notice it won't do to say, well, it's a free country. If I just want to have a belief, I can. It doesn't have to be about anything. I just got a whole pocket full of beliefs. No, that won't do, because beliefs have contents, and that content has got a name. It's an intentional content. Intentionality is directedness. It is the directedness of the mind. Examples of intentionality are beliefs and hopes and fears and desires as well as perceptions and intentional actions, intention in the ordinary sense and not the technical sense of intending. Have you got it now? You got the picture? Yeah. And as I said last time, there's some mental states that are honest to John mental states, but aren't intentional because they're not about anything. You know, there are times when you just feel kind of nervous or anxious. And I say to you, what are you nervous about? What are you anxious about? Well, I'm not really anxious about anything in particular. I just am jumpy. I just feel kind of jumpy today. That's a non-intentional state. Other questions? Somebody else had a hand up. Yeah.
I was wondering, this might be like a niggling thing, but I was wondering, you say something to the effect that speech acts are predicated on intentionality?
Yes. You cannot have a speech act without intentionality. And you're going to hear more about that because society is created by linguistic representation in a way that I'm going to try to explain to you precisely. Yes?
And if a subject has something like Tourette's...
What?
If the subject we're talking about has Tourette's, something...
Oh, had Tourette's syndrome.
Yeah.
Well, okay, but Tourette's is a very interesting case, and I don't know how much of it is intentional and how much isn't. One thing that ought to worry us is that there are social and anthropological variations in Tourette's syndrome. Not every society has the same kind of Tourette's syndrome. And look it up. I mean, I'm not an expert on this. Look it up, Tourette's syndrome. But there are forms of intentional behavior that are out of control. You see, we're going to get to this when we talk about free will. Our typical model of rationality is you're deciding who to vote for, and then you vote for this guy as opposed to that guy, and that's done as an exercise of your own free will. But there are lots of your behavior, if you're in the grip of a rage or an addiction, which are not manifestations of free will. Now, we assume that the person suffering from Tourette's syndrome is not acting of their own free will, but it's still intentional. There are lots of intentional behavior, which is not done of your own free will. Well, what the guy, a typical guy who has Tourette's syndrome is the guy who spouts obscenities, right? Okay, and that's what it's directed at, spouting obscenities. What's his intention? I won't imitate the behavior of the Tourette's, but I'll leave what are your favorite obscenities? The guy spouts the obscenities. That's the directedness. See, watch, I'll give you an example of directedness. I intend to raise my arm, and the damn thing goes up. What was my intentional state directed at? This. You just saw it, the arm going up.
So, in a sense, it would be the propositional content.
Well, we'll get to that later. It's a bit tricky. The propositional content, they have to distinguish between the prior intention and the intention in action. The prior intention has as its propositional content, or at least part of it, that I raise my arm. The intention in action has that the arm goes up. And we're going to get to that difference. Yes?
I think there's a real distinction between you raising your arm and the Tourette's utterances that are disclosed. It's more like groaning in pain from what I've seen.
In the case of the Tourette?
Yeah, it's not, this isn't intentional. It's just like...
How come it comes out as words?
Who knows?
I see.
And sometimes
Okay.
it doesn't. Sometimes it's grunts, ticks of the head.
All right. Okay, let's have a rule. Where nutcases are concerned, we're not trying to explain those. We'll leave that to the shrinks and the psychiatrists. I am now trying to explain ordinary garden variety intentionality according to which people conduct love affairs, revolutions, write great American novels, and vote for political candidates and attend courses in the university. There are all sorts of pathological cases that we don't know enough about to have an intelligent opinion about, or at least I don't. Any other questions? Yeah.
Going back a little earlier in today's lecture, if you accept some sort of hypothetical deductive model of society, are you committed to some sort of determinism?
You're not logically committed, but in fact you are. You could argue, well, there's an indeterminacy in the covering laws because you've got to allow for quantum mechanics. But in fact, the people who adhered to the deductive nomological model, the ones I knew, were determinists. They thought society is part of the real world, and the real world is determined according to the laws of physics. And the laws of society are as much deterministic as the laws of physics. Now, of course, you got quantum indeterminacy and all sorts of other messy things. But the idea of the deductive nomological or hypothetical deductive model was, and I'm sympathetic with this, we live in one world. And the explanatory mechanisms that work for physics have to work for sociology and economics, because the sociology and economics are as much a part of the world as anything else. Has everybody got that? Now, there's always a good guy, bad guy phenomenon here. And the deductive nomological guys in our sort of culture were regarded as vaguely the good guys, because they were for science and rationality and enlightenment, whereas there was something mystical and Germanic and mysterious and Hegelian about the Verstehen guys, you know. I mean, they were practically in bed with Hegel, for God's sake. I mean, and other German philosophers whose names start with H. And in my social group, you don't want to be caught hanging out too much with those guys. You get a bad reputation. However, on this particular issue, it seems to me the Verstehen guys have an important truth to state. Now, they typically say it in the wrong way. They say, well, you really have to get inside the mind of the person you're explaining. I don't think in that sense you do. You don't have to empathize with Hitler and think, well, he really was kind of a good guy, if only we understood him better. No, you just have to get in the explanatory apparatus the same concept that operated in the mind of the agent. Now, that's what's special about intentionalistic explanations, is the very same concept that functions in the explanation has to function causally in the behavior of the phenomena being explained. And that's not true in physics. This object doesn't think, I have to keep moving, accelerating, according to the law S equals 1/2 gt squared, or I'll let everybody down, because it doesn't think anything. Whereas the social actor has to keep thinking, well, here's what we're trying to do. We won the election. We defeated those guys on the health bill. Now, what the hell are we going to do about Afghanistan? Well, God knows. We better have some more sessions. I mean, that's the way they operate. Now, the intentionalistic character of that ought to strike us. We have to get the same term that functions in the explanation. That concept has to function causally. It doesn't. The concepts that are used in social explanation don't just describe the behavior of the entities whose behavior is explained, but the concepts themselves have to function causally in the behavior of the agents. Otherwise, you didn't get it. Okay, if you didn't understand that, don't worry. We're going to get to that. You're going to hear that in some detail. Yes?
I have a sort of related question. You mentioned earlier a few times that if you come up with a theory in social explanations, it has to not only be consistent with, but somehow be derived from physical explanations. So if you go on that view, how would you explain the fact that physical laws appear to be stable? They don't change, but our societal laws not only are wildly different geographically, but also through time.
Right. Oh, no, I love these questions. And basically what you're doing is asking me, give me the whole course right now, because it's a very deep question, but let me repeat it, because it's a very profound question. If I'm going to argue, as I am going to argue, that human mind and society is not just consistent with the rest of the world, but it's part of the physical world. Mind is a physical phenomenon like any other. It just has these properties that other physical phenomena don't have. And if I'm going to say that, as I'm going to say it in some tedious detail, then how is it that you get these historical contingencies? How is you get these dramatic changes in intentionalistic modes of explanation? So, for example, suppose I am suffering the angst of post-industrial man under late capitalism. I don't, in fact, but a lot of my friends think I'm vulgar because they do and I don't. I suffer the angst of post-industrial man under late capitalism. I think late capitalism is just fine. You know, I wish it produced more cash for professors, and it didn't have these stupid fluctuations. But it's, by and large, I'm very comfortable with late capitalism. The quality of the beer could be improved on, but it's pretty good. All right, but now this is not a worry that St. Thomas Aquinas could have had. St. Thomas, how about it? Do you suffer the angst of post-industrial man under late capitalism? he wouldn't know what you were talking about. It's all historically contingent. So one of our questions is going to be, how much of our explanatory mechanisms require historically contingent social phenomena as a part of the explanatory device? Now, to answer that even superficially, I'm going to have to introduce a crucial notion that I wanted to get to today, and that's the notion of the background, and then related to that, the notion of the network. That in our explanations, we take for granted a great deal of social phenomena in a way that physics doesn't have to take those for granted, because a lot of these social phenomena are contingent and historically situated. So if I explain the behavior of the following body, I don't have to explain certain features of history. But if I say, right now we're studying we're suffering the instabilities of post-industrial forms of capitalism, of a high-tech society, of the information with the consequent information technology, then that's very much contingent on a certain historical state of affairs. And that enters into what I call the network and the background. I don't have enough material out in the open to give an intelligent answer, but it's a very intelligent question, and you're going to hear more about it. And if I don't answer to your satisfaction, raise it again in a few weeks, okay? All right, any other questions? Now, this was going to be the lecture where I really polished off intentionality, but I'm going to have to talk fast if we're going to do that. So let's see how far we get. All right. One way to explain intentionality is to see the similarities and differences between intentional phenomena and speech acts. And the reason why that's such a neat way to do it is that the speech act is always an expression of an intentional state. So you can study the structure of the intentionality by looking at the study of the speech act. Whenever you make a statement, you express a belief. Whenever you give an order, you express a desire. Whenever you make a promise, you express an intention. Even if you're insincere, you still express those states even if you don't have them. So if you say it's raining when you don't believe it's raining, all the same you express the belief that it's raining, even though that's not a belief that you have. So the speech act has this structure. There's a certain type or force of the speech act. You assert that it's raining. The corresponding intentional state has this structure. You believe that it's raining. And in the case of an order, where you order somebody to bring it about that P, then the corresponding intentional state is the desire that P. Okay, so that's the first distinction. We made this on Thursday, but I want to repeat it. You need a distinction between the content of the intentional state and the type of intentional state that it is, and that parallels the distinction in language between the content of the speech act and the type or force of the speech act. In the speech act, it can be an assertion or a command or a request or a promise or a vow or a threat. In the intentional state, it can be a belief or a hope or a fear or a desire or a worry. All of those can have intentionality, but you need the distinction between the intentional content and the type of state that it is. Now, the second crucial notion that carries over to both language and mind is the notion of direction of fit. The direction of fit can be either where the mental phenomena represent how things are in the world, and that is the mind-to-world direction of fit, or it can be the other direction of fit, where the world is supposed to change to match the intentional phenomena, and that is the world-to-mind direction of fit, and that carries over exactly to language. So statements and assertions have the word-to-world or downhill direction of fit, whereas orders and commands have the orders, commands, and promises have the uphill or world-to-word direction of fit. The simplest test for whether or not something has this direction of fit is, can you literally say that it's true or false? It's a rough test, because sometimes we do say tiresomely, My wishes came true, meaning the thing I wished for happened. It's a rough test, but it's a pretty good test. Desires and intentions are not true or false in a way that beliefs and assertions are literally true or false. Okay, so far so good. Now I wanted to introduce a crucial notion, and that is the notion of conditions of satisfaction. Whenever you have an intentional state that has a direction of fit, either uphill or downhill, the fit will come off. Your desires will be fulfilled, your intentions carried out, your beliefs will be true. And what stands to the beliefs being true is what stands to the statements being true, is what stands to the orders being obeyed, is what stands to the intention being carried out. And in every case, I want to say, you can think of the intentional state as a representation of its condition or conditions of satisfaction. Wherever you have an intentional state with a direction of fit, it's either satisfied or not satisfied. The beliefs will be true or false, the desires fulfilled or not fulfilled, the intentions carried out or not carried out. And indeed, if we wanted a sort of rough notion, I'm trying to explain intentionality, we can say the key to understanding intentionality is conditions of satisfaction. Intentional states are the way that the mind has of relating to reality, and it does it by way of relating to conditions of satisfaction. Intentional states in general are representations of their conditions of satisfaction. Okay, but everybody's with us so far. Now it gets a little bit trickier. It gets trickier because sometimes you have a speech act where you take the fit for granted. I say, I apologize for stepping on your foot. Now, that's not trying to get your foot stepped on. It's not the word-to-word direction of fit, nor is it a claim that I stepped on your foot. I just take it for granted that there is a foot fit there. And in the book, I said, well, think of those as having a null direction of fit. But that's misled people, and it's my fault, because that suggests there's no fit. There is a fit, but it's presupposed, so I call it a perp fit. So you get downhill, uphill, and perp, where you presuppose that there's a fit. In the case of apologies, thanks, and congratulations, you assume, you take for granted that the thing you're apologizing for, the thing you're thanking for, the thing you're congratulating actually occurred. Congratulations on winning the race. My apologies for stepping on your foot. Thanks for giving me the money. All of those take the fit for granted. By the way, the genius of syntax comes out here. Typically, in English, where you have this direction of fit, you use infinitives. I promise to come and see you. I order you to leave the room. This I characteristically takes that clauses. I state that it is raining. You don't say, I state to rain. I state that it is raining. Here you don't have to say, I apologize, I order that you leave the room, or I promise that I will come. You can shorten it and use the infinitive. I promise to come. I order you to leave the room. Here you get this, the for-ing form. The gerund, I forget if it's called a gerund or the gerundive. I always forget. But anyway, it's some damn G. And you get that form where you take the fit for granted. I apologize. You don't have to say, I apologize to step on your foot. You say, I apologize for stepping on your foot. Not all languages have that mark, but English does. English marks in a rough and ready way this direction of fit with the infinitive and this direction of fit with the gerund, where you can say, thanks for giving me the money, not thanks to give me the money. And not all languages have that. When I first learned French, I had a French instructor who always showed up late, and he would say, excuse me, to be late. That's good French, but it's not good English. It's okay in French, excusez-moi d'être en retard. But in English, you have to say, excuse me, for being late. And that's a mark of the fact that the fit is presupposed. Okay, so here's what I want you to have. I want you to have the distinction between propositional content and psychological mode, the notion of propositional content as fitting reality in one or the other of the directions of fit, and most important of all, the notion of conditions of satisfaction, that you know what an intentional state is when you know its conditions of satisfaction. Okay. Now, if you understand all that, you're ready for the next stage. How much time did I leave myself? How much time we got?
20 minutes.
Oh, great. 20 whole minutes. Okay, here goes. You get some marvelous features which you get in language that you don't get in the mind. And at first it looks like it's kind of an oddball feature, but later on it's going to turn out it's absolutely essential to understanding human society. And that is, human languages, unlike any other animal system of communication known to me, has speech acts with both directions of fit at once, where you can adjourn the meeting by saying the meeting is adjourned. You can declare war by saying war is declared. You can make somebody president by declaring that person to be president of the United States. And in all of those cases, you change reality to match the speech act and thus achieve the world-to-word direction of fit, but you do it by representing reality as being so changed. Now that is a stunning and suspicious achievement that, as far as I know, only humans can do. It seems like a kind of word magic. You make something the case by declaring it to be the case. You make the meeting adjourned by saying the meeting is adjourned. The chairman raises his hand and he says, the meeting is adjourned. Now you want to know, how the hell do you know it's adjourned? Have you done a study? No. He makes it adjourned by saying it is adjourned. And speech acts like that have an odd name. I call them declarations. Okay? Declarations are where you make something the case by declaring it to be the case. And once you become aware of declarations, they're everywhere. One of my favorites is on American money. It says, this note is legal tender for all debts, public and private. Now, every one of us is an epistemologist. And as well-trained epistemologists, we ask, how do they know? Have they really done a study? Has there a scientific investigation conducted by MIT and other high-prestige institutions to find out whether or not it really is legal tender? No. When they say it's legal tender, they're not reporting a fact. They're creating a fact. They're making it legal tender by declarations. Everybody get that? And you'd be surprised how much of your ordinary conversations are infused with declarations and how essential they are for the creation and functioning of social reality. Okay, so I want you to understand this exists in language but not in the mind. I can't find any mental states that are sufficient to create reality just by thinking. Now, where God is concerned, all bets are off, right? I'm sure God can create reality just by thinking that it's created. And God can create reality by giving declarations. God makes light by saying, let there be light, and there is light. We can't do that, but we can do things like create universities, political parties, promises, a chairman of the philosophy department, and summer vacations, all by declarations. So you're going to hear more about declarations. Okay, so far so good. We now have 4 crucial notions for understanding human intentionality, human psychology. You have the notion of psychological mode and propositional content. You have the notion of direction of fit and the notion of conditions of satisfaction. Now then, let's get to nitty-gritty. Let's get to human actions. We've got to explain human actions. And to do that, we have to answer the question, what is an intention? And the temptation is to think, well, an intention is just like a belief or a desire. It's an intentional state that has conditions of satisfaction. The only special thing is that the condition of satisfaction of an intention is always a human action. So if I intend to work on my income tax tonight, then my intention represents me working on the income tax, and it'll be satisfied if I work on the income tax. And that looks like it ought to be right, that intentions are just like other intentional states, except they have human actions as conditions of satisfaction. However, it doesn't seem to work. There are some problems. And let me tell you some of the problems about the relation of intention and action. First of all, it ought to make us suspicious that we have a separate word for the condition of satisfaction of an intention. We don't have a separate word for the condition of satisfaction of beliefs and desires, because any state of affairs can be the condition of satisfaction of a belief or a desire. Why this special vocabulary about intention? Furthermore, there are all this other attendant vocabulary. You can do something unintentionally or inadvertently or on purpose. Now, what's all that got to do with conditions of satisfaction? How does that relate to the intentions? But worse yet, there are some famous counterexamples to the view that an action is the condition of satisfaction of an intention. And I'll tell you some of the most famous of these counterexamples. This is a case where the agent has an intention. He does the thing he intends to do, but he didn't carry out his intention. Or, watch this vocabulary, he didn't do the thing he did intentionally. And I now cite some famous philosophers who've given us examples like this. Now, these examples all have something in common that tells us something about the unconscious psychology of philosophers. They're all murderous or homicidal. But anyway, here they go. The first is due to Rod Chism. Chism was a philosopher at Brown University. He died a few years ago. And Chism imagines a case like the following. I edited it slightly, but this is the basic idea. Bill intends to kill his uncle. To this, he forms various plans about how he's going to kill his uncle. And one fine day, he wants to do that so he can inherit his uncle's money. One fine day, he's driving around the Berkeley Hills thinking about his intention to kill his uncle. And if you remember, at the corner of Euclid and Cedar, it's a very steep hill, and there's a stoplight there. He stops facing downhill on Cedar, and at a red light. He stops at the red light thinking about his intention to kill his uncle. And his intention makes him so nervous that his foot slips off the brake and he runs over a pedestrian. And if you've ever had a course in philosophy, you know the pedestrian was his uncle, right? Okay. He had the intention to kill his uncle. He did kill his uncle. And his intention caused him to kill his uncle. But he didn't kill his uncle intentionally. And indeed, his intention was, he didn't carry out his intention. It wasn't satisfied. Judge, it was an accident, he says truly, and I'm assured by lawyers we could get him off. He'll get off on that case. He intended to kill his uncle. His intention caused him to kill his uncle, but he didn't kill his uncle intentionally. Okay? Here's another example, this time, this one due to Donald Davidson. It's kind of variation on that one, but it's the same basic idea. A climber is holding another climber on a rope. They're both mountain climbers. And the first climber, who's holding the second climber, as Davidson says, wishes to rid himself of weight and danger. To that end, he forms the intention to release his hold on the rope. He's hanging onto this rope and thinking, I'm going to release my hold on the rope. But the whole scene makes him so nervous, he accidentally drops the rope. He didn't do it intentionally. He says, oh my gosh, oops, I seem to have dropped the rope. He doesn't say, now I'm going to do it. 1, 2, 3, lost. That's not what he says. That would be intentional. What he says is, oops, I seem to have lost the rope. Okay, as with Bill and the uncle case, he had the intention to loosen his hold on the rope. His intention to loosen his hold caused him to loosen his hold, but all the same, he didn't loosen his hold intentionally. He didn't carry out his intention. Does everybody see this point? So what's going on? There's something fishy about our idea that an intentional state is a representation of its conditions of satisfaction. Because here's an intentional state. I'm going to kill my uncle. I'm going to loosen the hold on the rope. And the intention causes me to do the thing I intend to do. I do it, but I didn't do it intentionally, and I didn't carry out the intention. So what's going on? Here's another example, an equally murderous and homicidal example. This is due to Davidson's student, Dan Bennett. And that's Bennett, not Dennett. Bennett was a graduate student of Davidson's at Stanford. And again, here's how it goes. Jones wishes to kill Smith. To that end, Jones goes out into a field where he knows Smith is, and Jones has a gun. And he aims his gun at Smith with the intention of killing him. He pulls the trigger, but unfortunately for Jones, unfortunately for Smith so far, Jones is a lousy shot. And as Bennett says, he misses Smith by a mile, misses him completely. However, all this happens near the Stanford campus up there in those hills, and there's a herd of wild pigs in the hills, and the shot stampedes the herd. And again, if you've ever had a philosophy course, you know what happens. The herd stampedes poor Smith to death. So, watch what happens. Jones intended to kill Smith. He fired the gun with the intention of killing Smith. Smith died as a result of the firing of the gun. But it seems odd to say he carried out his intention that he killed Smith intentionally. Rather, the shot stampeded a herd of wild pigs, and the wild pigs stampeded poor Smith to death. Okay, what's going on in all these cases? We have an intention. The state of affairs represented by the intention comes about, and yet we want to say the intention isn't satisfied, the intention isn't carried out. Now, it's always a good idea, Bertrand Russell says, to stock the mind with paradoxes, and I'm going to show you how we can use these counterexamples to develop a much richer theory of intention than the one that was implicit, where we just said, well, an intention represents an action you're going to do. No, I think it's trickier than that, and we're going to get a much more powerful conception of intention if we can answer this. Okay, now I've said a lot. Let's take questions. You guy on the floor, you didn't have, oh, I thought I saw your hand up. Any questions so far? Because I've given you a whole lot of a theory of intentionality, so let's take time for questions. Yeah?
Multiple concept, and how do you imply that I have an intention?
Yeah.
I want to raise my arm and I do it.
Yeah.
And then I'm satisfied.
Yeah.
What if I had the intention of raising my arm, I raise my foot?
And you raise what?
And I raise my foot.
You raise your foot instead, yeah?
And then I'm satisfied as well. I mean, where does
Okay.
the concept of logic and all this, where
Yeah.
does this come in?
Okay. An intentional state is a representation of its conditions of satisfaction. Condition of satisfaction doesn't mean what makes you feel good. It doesn't mean you're satisfied at last, because you might get satisfied by taking an aspirin or drinking a glass of whiskey. It's not that sense of satisfaction. It's satisfaction in the sense in which a propositional function can be satisfied in a model. It's like truth. It's a generalization of the notion of truth. So conditions of satisfaction doesn't mean conditions of feeling good. It means conditions under which there is a match between the intentional content and states of affairs in the world. Do you see that? So what makes my intention to raise my arm satisfied is that I raise my arm. Now somebody says, yeah, but you'd feel just as good if you took an aspirin or lay down until it went away. Maybe I would, but that's not the point of satisfaction in this sense. It's a technical term. It doesn't mean feel good. It means bring about the state of affairs where there is a match. Other question? Yeah.
You were saying that the paradox, or not, I don't know if it's a paradox, but about the killing of the uncle.
Yeah.
Or especially the shooting one. I feel like if you were to make it more specific,
Yeah.
if Jones wanted not just to, I mean, maybe if you just said his intention wasn't just to kill Smith. Maybe he had the intention to shoot Smith.
Yeah.
Then you could say his intention wasn't carried out, and it would work just the same as everything else. And same with the killing of the uncle with the car. He didn't just have the intention to kill his uncle. Maybe
Right.
he had the intention to, you know, stab his uncle
Right,
in his garage
okay.
tomorrow night, and he didn't do that. So
Okay.
It wasn't carried out.
It's great to have born philosophers in the class because both of these are very deep philosophical points. In the case of the Jones and the Smith, you want to say, well, how many details of his intention were there? And presumably, his intention wasn't just to kill him, but to kill him by getting the bullet to go from the gun to the victim. And of course, I don't have to tell you, philosophers have invented a whole lot of intermediate cases. Suppose it's the case that the bullet does go to the victim, but doesn't actually hit him, but it goes past him and it goes so close to his ear that it terrifies the victim to the point he has a heart attack and drops dead. Okay, what do you do about that case? Or here's another case. They're indoors and he shoots but misses the victim, but hits a chandelier, hits the cable holding a chandelier, and the chandelier falls on the guy and kills him. Or a third case. The bullet actually hits him, and it does cause a wound, but he doesn't die from the wound. He dies from a heart attack, which wouldn't have come except for the fact that he got a wound. Now, fortunately, lawyers and judges have to work out the details of this. Philosophers have a lot of fun figuring out what are we going to say in these cases. Now, that's what's puzzling about the first case. Okay, now about the other case, with, again, the problem there is we tacitly assume, as part of the background, that he's got some plan for killing his uncle, which does not involve his foot inadvertently slipping off of the brake pedal. But suppose, I mean, I never thought of this, but let's do it. Suppose he thinks, you know, in the actual crunch, I'm never going to have the nerve to kill my uncle. But what I ought to do instead is go and just keep going up and down Euclid in the red light, and eventually my foot will slip off the brake as he's passing by. What are you going to say in that case? Well, again, that's tricky. We're now with a network in the background. Now, fortunately, I am going to give you the apparatus for solving all of these questions, but not just yet. Okay, other question, how much time we got here? Yeah, all right. You're going to have to wait till Thursday for me to answer all those, but let's take other questions now. These are great questions. Yes?
You have these parallel ideas
Yeah.
of intentional psychological states and
Yeah.
speech acts. But isn't it I don't know, is parallel really the right word if it's a causal relationship?
Yeah. Is parallel the right word if it's a causal relationship? Again, this is a deeper question than you may be aware of. I am going to be able to solve this only by introducing the notion of intentional causation. There's a certain kind of causation whereby you cause something by representing the very thing you cause, or the thing that you represent causes something in you. And this is a case of both a perception, memory, and on the one hand, and intention and intentional action on the other, where you get a form of causation, which is intentional causation. And that's the next thing. I'm going to start explaining that because, again, that is absolutely crucial to understanding social phenomena, is the role of intentional causation. And again, it's familiar in social phenomena that you have unintended side effects. You have all of these things that people did not intend, and often with catastrophic results. The people who began the First World War thought it would be swiftly over and that their side would win with a minimum of casualties. They'd had an entire century without a major European war. And the last wars, like the Franco-Prussian War, or even better than that, the Schleswig-Holstein War, provided them with a model of elegant little wars where not very many people died. I have a wonderful book published, leather-bound, that lists every single German soldier who died in the Schleswig-Holstein War. I'm sure you have not lost a lot of sleep worrying about the Schleswig-Holstein War. It's one of Bismarck's minor wars for uniting the country. And that they all had these wars in mind when they went in the First World War. Little did they know that millions would die, that empires would cease, and that Europe literally would not recover for nearly a century. The 20th century began in 1914 and ended in 1989. It was a truncated century, but it was absolutely horrible from beginning to end. I'll get to how do we get off onto this? I wouldn't want to go into this much detail, but there is unintended consequences of intentional causation. The intentionality behind the First World War was very clear. The fallout was unexpected, and people never learn. Think of the current war in Afghanistan. They honestly thought the war would be over swiftly, and it was over swiftly. Bush had this wonderful scene on the aircraft carrier. Mission accomplished. Now, many years later, we're still struggling along. My oldest son is a lieutenant colonel in the Special Forces, and he thinks we're doing fine. We've won the war in Iraq, and now he's anxious to do the same thing in Afghanistan, and he may be right. It's just it was a much longer struggle than we were originally promised. Now, it's true. There, I'm going to tell you some things about warfare, but just a couple of them now. To begin with, if you're going to have a war on terror, most of the casualties are going to be civilian casualties. You should know that in advance. Every day the newspapers think, most horrible thing has happened. A civilian got killed. Oh my God. Well, it's terrible, of course, when anybody gets killed, especially innocent people. But the war on terrorism presupposes that most of the casualties are going to be civilian casualties for reasons that are not too hard to figure out. You can't see your enemy. He's busy hiding out among a bunch of civilians. In order to kill him, you've got to bomb the whole damn village, or at least the houses and the neighboring houses. And that means you're killing mostly civilians. Now, the second thing that's tricky is most of your casualties are going to be caused by friendly fire. Most going to be caused by your guys killing their own guys. Why? Well, because you're doing most of the firing. I mean, you've got all the firepower. That's what the American, well, okay, I've run out of time. But we will get through a military firepower and the structure of human intentional action on Thursday.